Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. This week on the show, ending sexual violence, from college students to women on the margins of society. We'll hear from Rebecca Nagle of Force about a culture-jamming campaign that put Victoria's Secret on the defensive, and an exclusive report on women in Alaska organizing against abuse. All that in my weekly commentary. Stay tuned. What role do corporations play in perpetuating a culture that excuses rape and other forms of violence against women? Our next guest has made international headlines through her creative feminist activism that's called attention to corporate misogyny, hatred of women. She's been behind a high-profile media prank against Victoria's Secret, another against Playboy, and she's collaborated with student activists around the U.S. on campaigns in support of a culture of consent. Artist and activist Rebecca Nagle is the founder and co-director of Force, Upsetting Rape Culture, and their latest project is a national monument to survivors of rape and abuse. Rebecca, welcome to the program. Glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Can we start with that name, Upsetting Rape Culture? What do you mean?
Yeah, so Force is an art and activist effort to upset what we see as the dominant culture of rape and to promote a counterculture based on consent. So we envision a world where sex is empowering and pleasurable rather than coercive and violent.
I love that you use the word upset, which is such a gendered word. It's usually always we who are upset, we females, and upset never is that serious.
I mean, we think of it as sort of like an upset, like in a football game, like the underdog coming in with an unexpected score. That I think one of the things that we do is that, these systems like rape culture are really big systems, and how as activists can we poke holes in these bigger systems?
Now, what is the state of what is the state of violence on campuses?
On campuses in the United States, women on campuses have a 25% chance of being assaulted while they are on campus. So actually, for women who are going to college, it actually increases your chances of being assaulted by going to college, which is insane.
Now, I went to college in the early 80s, and this was an issue then. We marched on campuses then. We had violence against women marches. We had Take Back the Night marches. There was a rape on campus. I remember organizing with people at Columbia and Barnard in New York City to get people suspended who hadn't been suspended, the guys accused, while this case was being investigated. How can this all still be going on, and what's actually changed? Anything?
Yeah, I think that's important to talk about in terms of sexual violence, to not forget where we have been and what the history is, because a lot of the stuff that we're working towards has already been done. So Title IX is a really good example. It's not that that law isn't in place, but it's that most universities aren't compliant.
Title IX protecting equal treatment on campuses and equal distribution of resources for women in students on campuses and schools too.
Yeah, and the idea is that if campuses are a place that are hostile to survivors, it's not a place for women to thrive and learn. A lot of work has done, and a lot of work continues to be needs to be done. I think that the main things that need to happen is we need a cultural shift where we support survivors and can hold perpetrators accountable, and also campuses need to be held accountable. I think what happens a lot is that universities treat campus sexual assault like a PR problem instead of a human rights problem. And so the incentive for campuses is to sweep it under the rug because they don't want it to make them look bad. And it's really student activists that have been doing a lot of work in the past several years to hold administrations and campuses accountable.
I mean, what's helpful about looking at the historic sort of the experience of so many years of campaigning is to try to think about what's worked, what hasn't worked. Clearly some things have worked, and you're coming up with some new strategies, one of which is holding corporations to account. Now, How do you blame corporations for rape on campus?
We've done 2 culture jams, one of Victoria's Secret and one of Playboy, and for both corporations we found very specific things and instances of rape culture. I mean, and I think just to back up and talk about what rape culture is and where it comes from, I mean, we live in a rape culture. So it's the air that we're breathing, it's the water that we're swimming in, it's in TV, ads, sitcoms, commercials.
Well, say what you mean by that, because there may be people that say, I don't live in this rape culture.
For me, what a rape culture is that it's seeing rape everywhere and having sexualized violence normalized to the point that it seems inevitable. So it seems
the
like
plot of every detective series on TV, the premise is usually some woman getting horribly knocked off.
Yeah, and the instance of rape culture that we found in Victoria's Secret that was really problematic is that they have a pink line that a lot of people might be familiar with if you've seen like pink on a tote bag or a pair of sweatpants, and they market the pink line towards college students and high school age students, and they have slogans on panties, and some of the slogans that we find that were problematic on underwear that they were selling said "sure thing" and "no" in really big letters with a little peeking underneath it, or another pair of underwear that said "stop" in really big letters and then staring underneath it. So it's using words like no and stop as a way to flirt instead of as a way to set a boundary. And so, and these are, you know, they're messages that they're basically selling to young women who are in that stage of their life. Like when I was 16, you know, I was still figuring out like, what is my sexuality? How do I feel sexy? And so like that moment that's really critical where people are starting to form that identity, they're selling, I think, a very rape culture message.
Now, you said you culture jammed them. What did that mean? What did you do?
So we made a fake website that people can still see at pinklovesconsent.com, where we pretended to be Victoria's Secret, and instead of the objectional slogans that I just explained, we were promoting consent-themed slogans. So we were Victoria's Secret, realizing the error of our ways, and now we had this new line called Pink Loves Consent that said things like ask first, and yes means yes, and consent is sexy, and I love my body, and there was information on the website about what consent is and how to practice it.
And what was the response of Victoria's Secret?
Well, after an overwhelmingly positive response from actually their customer base, like people found out about it via social media, thought that it was real. People really wanted to, we didn't have the underwear for sale, but people really wanted to find ways. And actually a lot of people since then have made consent underwear. It's been cropping up in a few different places. Victoria's Secret actively worked to take down the website, and they also suspended our Facebook and Twitter accounts. We had made Facebook and Twitter accounts, and in a day had gotten like 8,000 followers on Twitter, had like really used these as instruments to mobilize people. And I think if people are interested in culture jamming, it's important to understand the law. So what we did was totally legal according to parody and copyright law, but that doesn't mean that corporations won't go after you.
Yeah, now you did a similar thing with Playboy. What was that?
Yeah, so we did a culture jam of Playboy. So every year Playboy releases a top 10 party school list where schools are ranked by things like drinking and football, and women are listed as assets to a party campus.
Capital ASS?
Yeah, like they're like good scenery. So, you know, like Colorado University has hot women and mountains. How great. Shouldn't you want to go there? And so we found that to be problematic, and we made a spoof on that. So instead of releasing the top 10 party schools, Playboy released the top 10 party commandments. So we released our list like 2 days before they were going to release theirs. They actually delayed releasing their list by a week, and we totally disrupted the conversation. So when they did release their party school list, instead of people talking about party schools, people were talking about consent.
And you also ran a contest.
We did a Consent Revolution Award, so college students entered different consent activism that they had or ideas that they had done, and there was actually people won by how many likes their post got on our Facebook wall. So one student actually, it was interesting, she didn't, her project did not win, and she wrote to us saying that, you know, it was a little bit less than fair because even though like her post only got 800 likes, she had actually gotten over half of her campus to like it because she went to a really small school. And so, and I think what we found through both culture jams, and we do consent workshops on colleges and go and do quilt workshops on colleges too, is that there's an incredible amount of activism going on college campuses. And if you look at the change that we're having, both with the way that the media is talking about campus sexual assault, the way that legislators, the White House task force, that didn't come out of thin air. That came out of a lot of really direct and intense activism on campuses.
So good for you.
Yeah.
Now, what's the tradition that you see yourself in? I mean, we've interviewed the famous culture jammers, the Yes Men, on this program several times. Is that this tradition?
Yeah, we actually worked with Yes Labs when we were cooking up the Victoria's Secret prank, so we take a lot of information from them. We're both artists. Hannah Brancato is the other co-director of Force. So we're both artists and activists. We've also both done direct service with survivors, so we're pulling together a lot of different practices, but definitely the Yes Men.
And what's the pickup that you're seeing around the country? Because you're now traveling all around, talking to people about what you've done.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we're in a really special moment where, the ever-present epidemic of sexual violence, like what you were talking about, like the statistics have not changed, and it's an ever-present epidemic that's normally swept under the rug. And I think what's happened in the past few years is that we're starting to have the conversation, and hopefully through activism and direct action, we can sustain the conversation to change our culture.
So we have a little bit of video of your monument quilt project. Do you want to just set it up for us? What are we going to see?
So this summer, the Monument Quilt went on a 13-city tour across the United States. And the Monument Quilt is an ongoing collection of stories from survivors of rape and abuse. And by stitching our stories together, we are creating and demanding public space to heal. So we're working to change U.S. culture from a culture that publicly shames and isolates survivors to a culture where we can publicly support and honor survivors.
So let's take a look at the tape. Thanks. So that showed a lot of people looking at that quilt, wandering around. Is it always on campus that it's set up?
So during the 13-city tour, we visited 2 college campuses. So we did a display at Wesleyan University and University of Wisconsin Oshkosh. And then, we displayed the quilt in very different places. So we displayed it in downtown places like in Baltimore and in Baton Rouge. Here in New York, we displayed it at the Queens Museum in Corona Park. And we worked with lots of different organizations, from campus groups to statewide sexual assault coalitions to Native American tribal domestic violence programs. We displayed it in large cities and rural places.
And how do you measure your impact or your, I hate to say, sort of success? I mean, what does it look like, or how do you assess it?
That's a good question. I think that we are working to make change on a lot of different levels. So one of the impacts that we're seeing right now is with survivors and what we're hearing from survivors. And what we're hearing from survivors is that I have never felt safe in public in my life before. To disclose that I'm a survivor, like I walk around with this burden inside me and never feel safe to share it with people. And this is the first time I've had public space like that.
And there is activism cropping up all over. A lot of it's inspired by the work that you've done, the work of organizations like V-Day, Stop the Violence. In New York this fall, there's been a campaign with a woman carrying her mattress around the campus, again, back at Columbia and Barnard. Do you know, Emma, the woman involved in that?
I've seen the project, and it's a really, it hits you in the gut And it's such a smart demonstration of the weight of sexual violence, that she's carrying her mattress, and that it's this thing that normally we don't see survivors carry. Like I said, many survivors keep it hidden. They carry the burden. And one of the things that we're working to change with the quilt and in our work in general is that the burden of sexual violence should never be on the survivor. It should be on the perpetrator, and it should also be on community, because we're all in this and we all are part of this culture that's created this epidemic.
Who's talking to the boys and men about all of this? Because there's obviously work to be done, not just survivors coming out, but the abusers or potential abusers taking this on board.
I truly believe that rapists believe that what they're doing is normal and fine. Because if you look at, like we were talking before, commercials, TV, all of the things in their culture is telling them what they're doing is fine. And there's actually research, you know, that psychologists have done where they've spoken with perpetrators that they don't think that what they're doing is against the social contract. And so I think that one of the things that we try and do in our work is create less space for that.
And what can people do if they want to be part of it or find out more?
So there are lots of different ways to get involved in the Monument Quilt. Survivors, secondary survivors, and allies can create and submit their own quilt square. People can host workshops. So we're actually doing a campaign in October to do 30 workshops in 30 days for Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
Right.
So campuses, churches, people in their living room have been hosting workshops all across the country, and we have resources on how to do that on our website. And then we also have volunteer opportunities. You can donate to the project. All that stuff is at themonumentquilt.org.
And November is Violence Against Women Awareness Month, right?
Yep. And April, Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And it's like, you know, it
plenty
should
of
be,
opportunity.
it should be something that we work on year round.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Really great talking to you. Thanks for your work.
Thank you for having me.
There's more information about Rebecca's project at our website. In Anchorage, Alaska, the cold can make homelessness a death sentence.
I've been homeless for about 125 days now. You have to be with somebody at all times or you're gonna get beat up or raped or robbed. I've been all three. It's very cold, very wet, very sad. People don't survive, they die.
Many women on the margins turn to selling sex to survive. Tara, forced to sell sex as a child, asked us not to show her face on camera.
I think that the biggest sex trafficker, what induces the most people into prostitution is the state and the system. And my caseworker would come and take my money from me. He'd be like, well, you're just gonna use this to buy drugs. The system essentially removed my entire safety net and then kicked me out into the cold Alaskan winter, where, you know, the only options that I had to survive were prostitution or sleeping in a snowbank.
Sergeant Kathy Lacey heads the Vice Squad and oversees all prostitution arrests in Anchorage.
I think any time that a woman is selling her body for sex, it should be illegal. It's very degrading and exploitive. And we should quit calling it prostitution. We should call it what it is, which is sexual exploitation.
In 2012, Governor Parnell signed a law that redefines any action that promotes prostitution as sex trafficking. For example, owning or managing a home in which prostitution takes place is now trafficking. Of the first 4 people charged under the new sex trafficking law, 3 of them were women who were also charged with prostitution. Under the law, they were essentially charged with trafficking themselves.
There is a pretty widespread conflation of prostitution and trafficking right now, and we're seeing it in all of our anti-trafficking initiatives. Really, when you strip them down, turn out to just be anti-prostitution initiatives.
Kate Mogulescu founded the Trafficking Victims Advocacy Project. As an advocate for sex trafficking victims, she finds most anti-trafficking laws counterproductive.
The next breath that comes after that common refrain of we must get traffickers, we must investigate, prosecute, arrest traffickers, is the connection to then arresting people who are engaging in prostitution. There's this notion that the more people that you come in contact with through the criminal justice system, through an arrest process with police, the more you're going to get at the issue of trafficking. The wider a net you cast, the more people you bring in, that somehow, when the smoke clears and the dust settles, you're going to be able to figure out who's a trafficker, who's a victim, and justice will be done. And what we've seen repeatedly is that's not the case.
Maxine Dugan is one of the founders of Community United for Safety and Protection, a group fighting to reform Alaska's laws and policies related to selling sex.
And here in Alaska, the laws got rewritten so dramatically that we see that even people being busted in ordinary garden variety prostitution arrests are being charged with sex trafficking themselves. We see people who are working together, sharing space, for example, workspace, sharing customers can be charged. So that's really alarming when the safety conditions that we set up for ourselves are now being called, sex trafficking. The police are turning around and telling the reporters, and the reporters are turning around and telling the public that somebody is being rescued for being a sex traffic victim.
It shouldn't take a strike to keep first responders safe, but that seems to be what's required when those first responders are women. Hunks in hard hats we heroize. Women in scrubs, we're not so sure about. Casey Hickok, the nurse who went to Sierra Leone, got quarantined on her return in an outdoor tent at Newark Airport. Nurses at Bellevue, where New York's first Ebola patient got care, report being shunned in hospital elevators, whether or not they treated Dr. Spencer. One lost a teaching gig. Another's child was banned from daycare. New York officials have finally promised to protect health workers from losing pay or promotions if they have to be quarantined for work. The new protections are modeled after the rights granted military reservists, says the governor. If it takes a military metaphor, so be it. If we wouldn't send a soldier to the front without a weapon, why is it so hard for us to require that our frontline nurses be cared for? The nurses are our front line of defense, whether or not they go to West Africa, and there's a reason Liberians call Ebola the nurse killer. I spent a couple of days with National Nurses United this week. That's the nation's largest U.S. nurses organization. They're in contract negotiations with the California hospital chain Kaiser at the very same time that they're fighting for safe, effective Ebola standards. And the two fights are coming together and to a head this November. Why is it so hard to ensure protections for healthcare workers and ipso facto for their patients? Because nurses, they say, are low on the job security totem pole and taken for granted. In the days after Thomas Duncan first showed up with Ebola in Dallas, NNU received calls from nurses scared stiff that they'd be fired for disclosing that, contrary to the official talk of preparedness, Duncan's nurses had been left to tape their own gowns to their masks and their own skin exposed. Brina Aguirre, the Dallas RN who spoke up, should be remembered as the Karen Silkwood of our time, says NNU Executive Director Roseanne DeMauro. But atomic worker Silkwood ended up suspiciously contaminated and dead. It'd be nice if our nurses didn't have to go the way of Silkwood. The NNU has set November 12th for national actions, including a 2-day strike by 18,000 registered nurses at Kaiser. The latest Centers for Disease Control guidelines for Ebola care are a step in the right direction, they say, but they're still voluntary and full of loopholes, and they won't count for much without enforcement. The problem is deep. Without a national health system, even if the CDC set a standard, our nation's 5,000 different hospitals would still be free to make 5,000 different decisions. And when the vast majority are run for profit, dollars and cents have a way of trumping medical sense. Nurses see it daily, which is why NNU is calling on California, the 8th largest economy in the world, to set a national standard, including a legal mandate and full-body hazmat suits, and they're threatening strike action to get it. If nurses are on the outside, it tells you there must be something wrong on the inside of our hospitals, says tomorrow. If nurses were cops, we'd give them tanks. If they were firefighters, there'd be no quibbling about the quality of their fireproofing. If they were rushing into burning buildings instead of laying hands on sick people, we'd guarantee them protective gear. We'd mandate it. What is it we don't care about our nurses? You can write to me, Laura, at GRITtv.org, and tell me what you think. Thanks.
Anyone who wants to do anti-trafficking work needs to really roll up their sleeves and start doing anti-poverty work.
The problem that capitalists have is that they think that wealth is unlimited.
Right.
And the thing that socialists have to teach them is that, no, there might be unlimited stuff, but wealth is based on labor. Wealth is based on what you do with that stuff.